Now, Georgia happily lays its claim to tonight's guest, Ed Ball. He was born in Savannah, and though he moved away to attend Brown University and worked in New York for many years, he did live in South Carolina for a while and now lives in Connecticut. He does return to his native state from time to time, however, and on such an occasion as this evening, we're delighted and honored to have him back. He won the prestigious National Book Award for his first book, Slaves in the Family, in 1998. In that book, you may recall, he traced his origins back to a time when his family, a distinguished South Carolina white family, bought, sold, and controlled African slaves. In his second compelling book, The Sweet Hell Inside, he examined the generational mingling of the white and black strands of his family. And in his third book, Peninsula of Lies, he looked at the fascinating, confusing story of race from a most unusual perspective, that of the white man, an Englishman, who became a woman through surgery, and to complicate matters more, then married a black man. Needless to say, white society in Charleston, South Carolina, where this occurred in the late 1960s, was thoroughly scandalized. Now he has a new book, which he's here to discuss with us this evening, called The Genetic Strand. And once again, family is squarely at the center of his work. This time it involves utilizing the science of DNA forensics to investigate just who his forebears were. The answers, as you will discover when you read the book, are quite absorbing and introduce us to a marvelous cast of characters, including among many, the wonderful Aunt Betsy. We are very pleased to welcome back to the Georgia Center for the book, Mr. Edward Ball.
Thank you, Bill. I think that was a lovely summary of what I've done for the past 12 years. And you do such great programming here. There's a wall outside the auditorium with all of the posters of the covers of the books written by the people who've come through here, and it's quite a good wall, and I think it's only about a year's worth of work, right? The Genetic Strand, indeed. You know, I'm a non-scientist, and this book was one way for me to learn about hard science. I think that you scratch any family and you can peer through at an epic. Any family is carrying history and drama in its confines, a saga with the whole embedded narrative of American becoming within the borders of mother, father, children, grandchildren. It's a window on history, family, for me. And comes now DNA science in the past 15 years, in which one literally scratches the surface of the skin, analyzes the sample, sequences it, and outpours a wellspring of stories, tales of the human species and its emergence, medical dramas, crime stories. We can't turn on the television without encountering 2 or 3 documentaries in which DNA is this sort of linchpin of the ending, fingering the bad guy. But this book began with a piece of furniture. A few years ago, I inherited a very old desk, 200-year-old desk from someone in my father's family in South Carolina. It had been handed down all that time. One of those secretaries, meaning an 18th century piece of furniture, 7 feet tall, 4 feet wide, the size of a refrigerator. It had a flip-down writing surface, little cubby holes for letters. It was made of mahogany. And the thing was dilapidated. And I got it into my living room. It was beautiful, though dusty and missing a leg and leaning to one side, and it contained a secret. Wiggling around the cubby hole, I found a hidden compartment behind a piece of molding. And if you pulled out the molding, there was a drawer that wasn't visible to the eye, unless you knew it was there. Maybe it was where people kept money. I don't know. But what I found was a collection of human hair. 9 locks of hair, each folded up in a little piece of paper, yellowed paper with the name of a person and a date written on it. 1824, 1832, 1845, and the names of people, children, grandparents, middle-aged parents, from whom the hair had been collected. And I recognized these names. They were members of my dad's family, people who had actually lived in the house where this piece of furniture had been for generations and generations. And it was creepy, because a lot of the hair was 150 years old, 175 years old. All of the people were dead in the ground. This was the only thing left of them. Some of the hair was as beautiful and soft as the day it was cut from the 3-year-old boy's head. It was uncanny, disturbing. I'll read you the little bit about that. It was obvious the desk was unusable. To sit at the high writing service required a stool, and I found it awkward to sit up in the air like Bartleby the scrivener. The wood was scarred like a salad counter, and the interior shelving so delicate and dilapidated that if one touched a letter slot, it might crumble. On the other hand, the desk was quite beautiful beneath its raggedness, and it smelled musty like sheep. The smell and appearance gave it buried layers of meaning. The thing needed cleaning, the frozen drawers had to be unstuck, and the crevices wiped of grit. And with that, the wobbly desktop dropped open, revealing 6 slots for letters. In the midst was a small door, 7 inches square. The door had a lock with a skeleton key, and behind that door was a little cabinet with a bit of scalloped molding for decoration. With a touch, the molding moved, then it moved farther and came out. It was the face of a little drawer, though it had no knob. The drawer would have been invisible except to one who knew it was there, which I didn't. It opened easily, and from a puff of dust, it was clear it hadn't been disturbed in a long time. Later, I learned that other secretaries of the same period often possessed similar hidden drawers. Inside, there were a number of tiny envelopes the size of a matchbook. Their blotchy color and the formal handwriting suggested they had been stored 100 years or more. Opening the first packet, I was bewildered to find that it contained a beautiful lock of human hair bound with a silk ribbon. The next packet held more hair scattered inside. It was a small collection of family hair. It was mostly brown, with one lock of bright blonde curls and a couple of others with reddish tint. One was labeled Aunt Betsy's hair, and another was W.J. Ball's hair, aged 3 years, 1824. I'd wanted an antique. Instead, I'd gotten a crypt. Although a strand of hair wasn't a bone, it was a bit of a person, the only thing left of them. After this surprise, this rendezvous with the deceased, I felt an uncanny presence and a touch of nausea. Out of the laconic desk, an unwelcome aura seemed to have entered the room, the result of my having interrupted the sleep of ages. My stomach clenched and my hearing sharpened, that the stash of relics comprised bits of people to whom I was related, whose genes I shared, raised the levels of anxiety. DNA science has soaked itself into popular culture, but I, like many Americans, have had little training in the subject. And after I got over the creepiness of this discovery, it occurred to me, archaeologists are coming into the newspapers now and then with having sequenced the DNA of Neanderthal bones, or the DNA from a mummy's remains out of a tomb in Central Egypt. What if this hair contained DNA? What would that mean? If it contained DNA, could stories be told from that? And so I began to ask around. The first scientist I met was a woman named Terry Melton. She's about 55, thin, wiry, energetic woman in jeans, cowboy boots, a silver buckle on her belt. She lived in a small town in the middle of Pennsylvania called State College, where she ran her very peculiar business, which was to examine the hair from crime scenes. I visited her in her office in an old renovated doctor's suite in a mini mall. And there, once a day, the FedEx truck would drive up and slap down 5 or 6 envelopes from different police agencies around the country, each envelope containing the same thing, a lock of hair or a single hair from a crime scene in Los Angeles or in Chicago or wherever. Evidence collected by police, and her job was to extract the DNA from this hair, sequence it, throw it against databases that the FBI and police had been developing, and make a report. So I sat down with Terry Melton. Well, if anybody could figure out DNA in hair, this is the woman. No, you can't get DNA out of his hair. It's too old, she said. You know, the oldest hair I've sequenced was 32 years old. Someone once sent me, I once got a letter from the Napoleonic Society of Paris, France. They purported to have a lock of Napoleon's hair, which they sent to me. And by golly, there wasn't a single molecule of DNA in that hair at all. It was too old. Too much heat, too much moisture. It was too old. You just can't do it. Forget about it. It's brittle. Very discouraging. But I had a peek into this strange business, forensics, what people do. Well, there's a private side of forensics. It's not all police agencies, and this woman worked in that vein. I flew to England. I wanted to meet the guy who had created DNA fingerprinting. This is the technique used in all law enforcement agencies around the world. It's the technique that is the linchpin of the plot of all of those crime shows and all those murder novels, where a tiny bit of trace evidence from a crime scene is magnified, sequenced, and compared with the DNA of various suspects, and supposedly identifies one person in 100 million. DNA fingerprinting, so-called. So I met this guy named Alec Jeffries in a university in the middle of England called Leicester. Very gruff, sort of ruddy-faced guy, slightly overweight, khaki pants are too tight, hair not washed in the last 3 weeks, hunched over his lab desk, waving away people like myself who want to talk to him about his work because it's just too engrossed in the material. It took me 5 or 6 phone calls to get him to agree to see me for 30 minutes. Alec Jeffries, yes, what do you want to talk about? Well, about your amazing discovery. Well, that's what everybody wants to talk about. Well, 20 years ago, he did change the world when he figured out how to identify the sequence of bases in a DNA molecule for a distance of, let's say, 30 bases here and 30 bases there, and used that as a template to compare other sequences from individuals, and he called it DNA fingerprinting. And it has changed. It has changed the world. And the interesting thing about this man, Alec Jeffries, this gruff, intense intellectual, is that he almost would rather have not changed the world because it just causes him too much trouble. He wants to just go on to the next project. So here was a guy who was inside research, bunked down in research. I couldn't even interest him in my queries about the content of his hair. I went to California. I come to this company called Trace Genetics. Now, there are about 8 or 10 private entities around the country that sequence DNA for individuals who are doing family history. Trace Genetics was a company that specialized in identifying sequences belonging to people with Native American ancestry. Anyway, so I gave this company 2 or 3 locks of hair, and they come back with the report. I talked to the scientists working on it. They come back with a report in a couple of weeks. Say, oh, we got DNA out of the hair of this W.J. Ball, 4-year-old child from 1824. Great. My great-great-grandfather, just coincidentally. And by the way, turns out he has 15% genetic contribution from Native Americans in the Southeast. Well. This was a surprise. And this is where I got more interested. Oh, so maybe we have some Indian ancestry. Maybe we're not the super white people that we thought we was. I'm going to cause some trouble. And this shook out from my memory another character from my father's family story that I hadn't thought about. A woman named Kate Fuller, my dad's maternal grandmother. I didn't have a sample of her hair, but I had a photograph of Kate Fuller. See her peering above she's in this book. A photograph from the 1880s. She's a woman of 35. She's wearing a bustle dress, scowling at the camera, standing in a kind of parlor. And she looks like she might have been a person of color. Just possibly. More dark-skinned than all the other relatives of whom we had photographs. And a couple of cousins of mine agreed, well, maybe this person, because we didn't know much about Kate Fuller's background. She came from a family called Fuller in Beaufort, South Carolina, who had previously apparently come from Barbados. We didn't know much about this person, whereas we knew a lot about a lot of the other people. Well, what if Kate Fuller was a person of mixed race? Well, I didn't have a sample of her hair, but I had a first cousin who carried the same mitochondrial DNA as Kate Fuller. There's a kind of DNA called mitochondrial DNA, which passes from mothers to daughters, and from daughters to their daughters. It also passes from mothers to sons, but the sons don't pass it to their children. It's matrilineal only, and it never changes for thousands of years. A mother and her many generations of descendants among women will all have the same mitochondrial DNA. So I had a first cousin who was a matrilineal descendant of this woman who carried the same mitochondrial DNA as her. I asked, would you let me analyze your DNA and see what comes up? We engaged a company to do an analysis of it, and comes back a report that says, oh, this DNA contains a 4% genetic contribution from West Africa. Sure. A 4% genetic contribution from West Africa. Well. Ain't that something? So here I was in the midst of this journey, and my world was starting to shift. And I began to look at my identity in a new way, in an expanded way, stretching. Now, this is, something I've been thinking about, working on and writing about Southern families and black and white people together for a better part of a decade. And yet, this event, these DNA results, stretched me in a new way. Why? Because DNA is this religious substance. It is the answer to all questions. It is the secret of life. We treat it like it is the sacrament. And whatever it says, whatever the scientists say about it, we believe it. That's why This was stretching me. So, I'm rethinking my identity. And more stories come back to mind. Some of them not very pleasant. And this is one of the least pleasant ones, but bear with me. My mother's family had come from New Orleans, and in their history I know something about two family names, Rowley and Lecorne, one of them English, the other French. Neither group would wish to be found carrying the DNA of West Africans. The degree to which this would be unwelcome might be seen in the behavior of my mother's great-grandfather, a man who possessed the melodic Baroque name of Polycarpe Constant Lecorne. Of his extraordinary name, I know that Constant and Lecorne were surnames from France. Polycarp had been the name of a Christian martyr in Smyrna during the 2nd century A.D. Polycarp Constant Lecorne had been my mother's father's father. He was said to have been a second lieutenant in the Civil War, a flag bearer who served a few months in Virginia before returning home. Later, according to lore, he and a friend walked up the Mississippi River Delta, the Mississippi River levee from New Orleans to Jackson, Louisiana, where the two enlisted in the so-called 13th Trans-Mississippi Regiment, an outfit that Polycarp seems to have preferred to the one in Virginia since he did not desert it. After the war, he kept up his rebellion. Reconstruction, including the occupation of Louisiana by a victorious army, which left many whites with a contempt for Northerners and did little to dissolve their long dislike for black people. Some whites tried to do something about the infamy of Negro rule, which occurred after a black governor took office in Louisiana. And one of the whites was Polycarp. In his middle years, he joined a militia known as the White League. Formed during the 1870s, the White League succeeded an earlier insurgent movement, the Knights of the White Camellia. Both mobilized old Confederates to engage in subterfuge and violence. The White League targeted black people in authority, as well as liberal whites. And it differed from the Ku Klux Klan in that it wasn't a secret organization. In Louisiana, the League became the main supremacist front, leading an uprising against Northern occupation and engaging in battles with Louisiana's state militia, which was mostly black. White League vigilantes stalked and killed black leaders, and its mobs killed several black state legislators. My mother's family lore reports that our good predecessor, Polycarp Lecorne, was a soldier in the White League. It is remembered that he took part in the decisive confrontation, the Battle of Liberty Place, in New Orleans on September 14th, 1874, when the New Orleans Metropolitan Police, an integrated militia of 600, backed by 3,000 black state militia, faced White League units numbering several thousand. 11 police died, 60 wounded. 16 White Leaguers were killed, 45 were wounded, including Polycarp, who, according to family lore, had his head split open. After the battle, which took place in the very center of New Orleans, the Union occupiers of Louisiana decided to give up and leave. Reconstruction ended and white rule returned. Polycarp lived another decade, dying in 1886. I never heard directly about his private war, either from my mother or from anyone else in her family. But my mother had an aunt, an unmarried school teacher named Maud Lecorne, who, after retirement, wrote down some family history that she'd absorbed from her parents. It was in Aunt Maud's genealogical notes that I first encountered the supremacist legacy of Polycarp. That's the context. Scratch a family and stories come out. So, science, as I came to understand it, requires corroboration. It requires the duplication of results. You can't just have one experiment with one result. You have to have a second that duplicates the results. Otherwise, you can't make an assertion about your project. So I continued to send the same samples of hair around. From Cambridge, England, a different lab took the same sample of this William Ball with Native American genes and returned a different result. No, the report said, this boy did not have Native American contribution in his genes. There are no markers in his genome that would suggest that. Perhaps there was contamination. Now, contamination, I didn't know at the time, is something that geneticists don't talk about because it jeopardizes the whole system of authority. You have to use technical equipment in order to magnify the sample of DNA, something called a polymerase chain reaction machine, which is literally, this was like a little desktop device. And you have to use a sequencing machine where you put a sample in the machine and it runs it through a channel in order to read off the sequence of bases. In any case, thousands of samples are going through these machines in a year's time, and if they're not properly cared for, the tiniest speck of molecular evidence could contaminate the next sample. Perhaps it was contamination. So I had contradictory results and ambiguity. I sent the cheek swab of my first cousin to a lab in Denmark where a guy named Tom Gilbert, who works on ancient DNA, comes back with a contrary result. He says, no, there's no West African contribution to this sample. The West African contribution that had been alleged was alleged to have come from Senegal, from a group called the Serer people of Senegal. But, according to this lab in Denmark, not all geneticists know or present the full story, which is that the same markers appear in southern Europe in greater frequency as this particular tiny segment of Senegalese DNA. In other words, 3/4 or 9/10 of the samples that one would randomly take from a population that have these particular sets of markers would be coming from southern Europe, and 1/10 would be coming from Senegal. An ambiguous result. And that's not to say that there was not a genetic contribution from West Africa. Indeed, there's still a question in my mind. What it does say is there's uncertainty, which was frustrating and interesting. What it did, this journey, which I've sort of summarized and cut down to a soundbite, it's actually much more varied with many more turns and twists and cliffhangers. What this did was allow me the opportunity to stretch my sense of self, my sense of identity. As we all know, in the South, historically, when white fathers and black mothers, historically, in the days of Jim Crow, in the slave days, had children, when black women had children by white men, coerced into sex with white men, those children typically were pushed away from white society and raised by black families. They were not raised in the white household. And so as a result, as we all know, many African American families know who their white relatives are. And most white families do not know, or do not care to know, who their black relatives are. So there may have been cases in which the tide went the other direction, but I wasn't able to uncover them, at least not in this way. Nevertheless, this project reminds me of the interwoven nature of our national inheritance, the interlocking structures of our linked families. In fact, one of the peculiar statistics that I did uncover was that perhaps 5% of white families have ancestors of color, typically ancestors at some distant remove who came from West Africa, that they're not aware of for various reasons, for reasons of the stories not being passed down or whatnot. And of course, we are living white, just as black families live black, even though we have all been in each other's beds. If you catch my meaning. Yeah, not to make light of it, but I do think that we have a country that has a set of artificial structures, artificial categories, and that the categories are much more porous. There is a lot more of mingling of our genomes than anyone is prepared to contemplate. Do you remember in 2000 when the census was being prepared, the Census Bureau contemplated introducing a new category which was multiracial? And there was a big feud over that. Well, that's kind of where we are and are going rapidly. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. Identity is malleable. It's uncertain. White is not only white. Black is not just black. And science, I learned, is not the religious vocation, the authority, the unquestioned locus of truth that it alleges itself to be. Well, thank you very much for coming. I'm happy to talk about the science or the stories some more if you would like to stay a little while and do that. And I think, anyone in this room would have a similar story if they took a time to dig a little bit, and perhaps someone would like to share their experience with DNA. I think there's a funny phrase in the marketplace. It's recreational genetics, which is not. Someone said to me today, I thought that's what having sex was. No, but it's actually testing your DNA in order to do family history. Yes.
How much do you estimate that you spent on going to these various locations and doing business with these various labs?
How much money?
Yes.
Oh, I'm not sure. I spent a good bit. Good bit. That would be my estimate. A good bit. Yes, sir.
My mother traced her ancestry back to the 1650s in Virginia. They raised
Tobacco.
By going through the genealogies that she and an older cousin had spent years putting together as evidence of slaves, but mostly in inventories
Yeah.
as opposed to stories or anecdotes.
Sure.
And I have, after reading your book, Slaves and the Family, felt very much like there's that unknown. Or as you say, some people just don't want to know what the relationship is. And I see that as a real barrier to any kind of reconciliation.
Sure. No, it's true.
Of our sense of being American and sense of that kind of equity.
Yeah. No, it's true. It's true.
While I see individual stories like you're describing as being very powerful, I really wonder how this can be translated into more of a powerful thing that begins to allow us to
Yeah.
reconcile.
Right. Well, I think what I try to do is to give in my small way, as one individual writing non-best-selling books, is to try to give language to people, tools to talk about our shared racial inheritance. One of the things that we lack is that shared language. And it makes it much easier to talk about the past and our shared trauma honestly and naturally if you have the right words that name the right emotions, and you don't run away in fright, which has been our problem. There is not going to be a top-down answer to our national cleavage over black and white, not like the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1965. There's going to be, and there is going on, a person by person, family by family, one individual at a time, long march to common understanding. And that's the only way it will happen, is osmotically and from the bottom up. And it's going to take longer than any civil rights project had taken. Yes?
You were evidently looking mainly at what the DNA people are calling the deep ancestral origins.
Yeah.
Did any of the labs analyze for you matching with specific living, other living relatives that you might have not been sure about? If you had a connection?
Right. No, I wasn't going in that direction. I was more interested in this hair, which carried only, by the way, mitochondrial DNA.
I wanted to, that was my second
Yes.
question. Was it all mitochondrial?
All mitochondrial, not chromosomal DNA, which would have allowed the kind of thing that you're talking about more easily done. Yes?
Did you do any blind testing with results? In other words, it sounded like you took one sample of the fiber and gave it to one lab, and then you sent it to another lab and gave them another result. But did you take the same person's fiber and send it as if, say, 3 pieces?
Yes. That's what I was doing.
3 different people to the same lab.
No, I didn't do that. I took the same...
That's a blind test. That tells you what lab knows what they do.
Yeah.
They don't like that. More often than not, you'll find that there's some area in their testing that they don't clean. That's
Yeah,
the whole
yeah, yeah.
medical profession these days. It's
Right.
really safer not going to
Right.
the laboratory.
Yes.
Going it. But
Yeah.
there are very specific ways of identifying whether you're getting results.
Yes.
And one of those ways is give the same sample over and over.
Yeah.
You get the same answer. They'll be puzzled and say, how come it's very similar, organic?
Yeah. Right.
The other way, you say, oh, but we want the same sample. And they'll say, oh, that's wonderful. That shows our test is good. But if you get the other results, they will not be happy. But you might be able to feel more confident.
Good intervention. Yes.
I am part of the Ball family, and I have written to you about some of this. And what was the reaction of the family when you wrote the book about slaves in the family and about this?
Right. Well, it was 10 years ago that I wrote Slaves in the Family. And the reaction then is different from the reaction today. It's changed dramatically. The reaction at the time was it divided the family into factions. The people for, and it very much was for or against. People for what I was trying to do. I wrote a book about my father's family in South Carolina who were slaveholders for 200 years. Telling that story of that group of people and finding African American families today whose ancestors we had once enslaved, and with their participation and consent, telling their family stories from slavery down to the present, so that the book combined the white and black narratives and mixed race narratives, 200 years straight down to the present. And it was divisive in my dad's family. It set old people against young people. It sent young people, it sent women against men, and it sent a lot of people against me. But a lot of that has alleviated because there was a lot of fear, a lot of fright. People were afraid bad stuff was going to happen to us because we were coming out and saying, we are it. Come and get us. That's what people were afraid of. Irrational fear. I mean, you wouldn't believe the sense of panic. I mean, I would go into the dining room of a well-heeled cousin who was a physician, and he would say, my children are young. If anything happens to my children as a result of what you've written, I'm going to hold you responsible. I mean, the fear was very intense, but it's calmed down now, and there's much more interest in it. There's much less antagonism. A lot of the middle-aged people understand it better, so it's gotten better. Okay. Yes, sir.
Well, speaking of reason, I wonder if I understand the societal pressures and our concern about race over the years. I'm a native Southerner. But apart from that, isn't all discussion of race irrational? It really has nothing to do with science. That we're all a single species.
Sure.
And
Social category.
outside of that, everything is irrational. That I'd love to trace my DNA and find all sorts of colors and everything.
Yeah.
But even that's sort of irrational.
Yeah.
It would just be fascinating for me.
Right.
But it wouldn't make me any different as a human being.
True. Well, I wish you would have asked that 20 minutes ago because there's a lot to say about it. The two things I'll say very rapidly is that generally the number that's agreed on in genetics is that 99.9% of our genomes are identical, and there's one tenth of 1% where there are tiny variations in DNA. What race, the category of race emerged, in the 18th century. It was magnified in the 19th century. And what genetics says about it is largely what you say, which is that we don't want to use this category as a social category. But genetics has traced the evolutionary history of the species and its migration around the globe. And during that migration, the groups that moved to Europe, the groups that moved to East Asia, that moved to India, and stayed for tens of thousands of years, each in those locales developed tiny, tiny markers or mutations in their DNA, which, if you read the sequence, allow one to say, well, this person's deep ancestry is to India. Deep ancestry is to Northern Europe or to Southern Africa. So geography comes in as a kind of, as soon as you do away with the category of race, geography reasserts it with a new face. And that's where the science is now. So I'm sorry to have to break away to catch this flight because you are such a great audience and we're just starting. But thank you so much for coming. If what is here if they intend to connect or series will home from in that so I began to do grassy town and for the success and rats a minute that woman's came the aerial milk which is nothing about 55 in the what free air generator will make and G seen and recorded people in suit and see bells She lives tall and out middle Venus in called state hall conjunction and you read her very good cure. She was in the best for the them and Sarah H. from this time that I visited her in her office business sold in written in her doctor's office and tweet picture in many malls. And where they didn't say expect a drug of a drug days and found cigarette levels and so different from Ali I can say rest logic easy and she's closing they take the section I think so I can air and the stairs like her crime seems to be moving from her chicken so wherever and evidence to collect by disease her stomach's that an idea is from her hair and what is to say out of this is so is be identified sadly to been on yeah